A lone samurai stands guard as cherry blossoms drift silently to the ground. This is the iconic image of feudal Japan, a world of honor and war that feels frozen in time. But its rise was anything but peaceful. This is a detective story, a deep investigation into how a society of warriors and shoguns emerged from the ashes of an ancient empire. We will unravel this epic by comparing Japan's path to the medieval kingdoms of Europe, a method that reveals startling truths. By the end, you will understand the unique recipe of conflict, culture, and leadership that forged a system lasting for centuries. Why did Japan's emperor become a powerless figurehead while European kings grew stronger? How did a code of honor born from chaos create one of history's most enduring social orders? What does the rise of the samurai tell us about how power is truly built? The imperial court in Kyoto was a world of exquisite poetry and refined etiquette, a place where the flick of a fan could convey a secret message. Yet this dazzling cultural golden age, known as the Heian period, was built on a foundation of sand. For centuries, the emperor and his nobles in the capital lived in a bubble of luxury, increasingly detached from the rugged countryside they nominally ruled. Their authority did not extend much beyond the city's borders, and into this power vacuum stepped a new kind of man, the samurai. Originally hired as provincial tax collectors and peacekeepers, these warriors began to build their own private armies, answering more to local lords than to the distant emperor. Great clans like the Terra and Minamoto grew rich and powerful, their loyalty shifting from the throne to their own family interests. This is the great paradox of the Heian era, a time of unparalleled artistic achievement that simultaneously rotted from within. While Japanese courtiers composed delicate verses about the moon, European monarchs like William the Conqueror were brutally consolidating their kingdoms. William's victory at Hastings in 1066 forged a unified England under a powerful crown, a stark contrast to the fragmentation happening in Japan. So why did Japan's central authority crumble while Europe's often strengthened? The answer lies in land. In Europe, kings granted land to nobles in exchange for military service, a system known as feudalism that for a time reinforced royal power. In Japan, however, a different system called the shun allowed local lords to amass vast private estates completely free from imperial taxation and control. The emperor in Kyoto slowly became a ceremonial figurehead, his political power draining away like water into the dry earth of these independent domains. The stage was set for a storm, and the samurai clans were ready to unleash it. That storm finally broke in the year 1180, a conflict so brutal it would be remembered for 1,000 years. The Genpei War was a clash of titans, pitting the mighty Terra clan against their bitter rivals, the Minamoto. It was a civil war that engulfed the entire nation, a brutal struggle that one chronicler described as turning the capital into a sea of flames and the provinces into a wilderness of bones. This was not a simple battle for territory, it was a war for the very soul of Japan, a fight to decide who would truly rule the emperor's land. On one side stood the Terra, who had grown arrogant with power at court, and on the other, the Minamoto, who rose from the ashes of a previous defeat, hungry for vengeance. The conflict produced legendary heroes whose stories would become the bedrock of Japanese culture. Figures like the brilliant, tragic General Minamoto no Yoshitsune. A tactical genius, Yoshitsune led his clan to stunning victories against overwhelming odds, most famously at the naval battle of Dan no Yora. There, in the Shimonoseki Strait, the final, devastating act of the war unfolded. As the Minamoto forces closed in, the grandmother of the young Terra Emperor, a child named Antoku, made a horrific choice. Believing capture and humiliation by the enemy was a fate worse than death, she took the boy in her arms and leaped into the cold sea, plunging the imperial regalia into the depths with them. The Terra clan was utterly annihilated, their name erased from power. This war bears a striking resemblance to another great noble conflict, England's War of the Roses, which pitted the House of York against the House of Lancaster for the English throne. Both were devastating civil wars driven by the ambitions of powerful aristocratic families, yet their outcomes could not have been more different. In England, the war concluded with the victory of Henry Tudor, who merged the rival houses and founded a powerful new dynasty that centralized royal authority. The English crown emerged stronger than ever, but in Japan, the victor, Minamoto no Yoritomo, did not seek the throne for himself. He did something far more revolutionary. He used his military triumph to create an entirely new system of government, the shogunate. The emperor remained in Kyoto, a revered but politically powerless symbol, while real authority moved east to Yoritomo's military capital at Kamakura. He became the shogun, the supreme military commander, and the true ruler of Japan. So why did a similar war of noble rivalry produce a strengthened monarchy in England, but a parallel military government in Japan? The answer lies in the concept of legitimacy. In England, power was always understood to flow from the crown. The war was about who would wear that crown. In Japan, power had already drifted away from the imperial court and into the hands of the warrior class. Yoritomo did not need to become emperor. He simply needed the emperor to grant him the title to legitimize the power he already held. The Genpei War did not just change who ruled, it changed the very nature of rule itself, replacing a crumbling imperial court with a samurai-led state built for war. So with the Minamoto clan victorious, a new question hung over Japan. Who would now command the loyalty of the samurai? Minamoto no Yoritomo's answer was a political masterstroke. Instead of moving into the imperial palace in Kyoto, he established his own military headquarters far to the east in the small coastal town of Kamakura. This was the birth of the bakufu, which literally means tent government, a term that evoked the mobile camps of a field commander. In 1192, the emperor formally appointed Yoritomo as shogun, granting him ultimate authority to command all the nation's warriors. But the real genius was not in the title, it was in the location. By remaining in Kamakura, Yoritomo created a parallel power structure entirely separate from the old imperial court. He was not replacing the emperor, he was building a new state for the warrior class right beside the old one. To make this system work on the ground, he created two key positions that would become the backbone of feudal Japan. He appointed shugo, or military governors, to oversee entire provinces and maintain order. And more importantly, he installed jito, land stewards, on private estates across the country. These jito were his eyes, ears, and tax collectors, directly loyal to the shogun in Kamakura, not to the court nobles in Kyoto. This gave Yoritomo a nationwide network of control that bypassed the ancient imperial bureaucracy entirely. It was a complete overhaul of the country's power grid. This strange division of power, with a spiritual emperor and a practical military ruler, finds a fascinating parallel in medieval Europe. Think of the ongoing struggle between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. The Pope held immense spiritual authority, much like the Japanese emperor, while the emperor wielded temporal military power similar to the shogun. They were locked in a constant dance for supremacy, each claiming a divine right to rule. But in Japan, this duality was not a conflict, it was a settled arrangement. The emperor remained the unchallenged spiritual heart of the nation, while the shogun managed the messy business of war and politics. This is what made Japanese feudalism so unique and so stable. It was not a system of competing powers, but a carefully balanced partnership between the sacred and the martial, allowing the samurai class to govern for centuries without ever needing to dethrone the emperor. Yet this new shogunate, designed to last for centuries, faced a crisis of succession almost immediately. Minamoto no Yoritomo died, and his line of shoguns proved surprisingly short-lived. Into this power vacuum stepped a new group of master manipulators, the Hojo clan. They did not seize the title of shogun for themselves. Instead, they perfected the art of ruling from the shadows. A Hojo woman had married Yoritomo, and after his death, her family installed her son as a puppet shogun. Then they created a new position for themselves, the regent, the shikken. As regents, the Hojo held the real power, governing in the name of a series of young, weak, or figurehead shoguns who were often mere children or distant imperial princes brought in from Kyoto. For nearly a century, the Hojo regents were the true rulers of Japan, a dynasty of puppeteers who never sat on the throne. Their genius lay in administration, not conquest. They understood that to control a warrior society, you needed more than just military strength. You needed laws and order. Their greatest legacy was the Gosubai Shikimoku, a legal code established in 1232. This was a revolutionary document, a set of 51 articles written specifically for the samurai class. It laid down clear rules for land disputes, inheritance, and criminal punishment, creating a predictable legal framework that replaced arbitrary clan justice. For the first time, a nationwide standard of law governed the warrior class, and it was enforced not by the emperor's court but by the shogunate in Kamakura. This focus on legal reform mirrors the actions of powerful regents in other parts of the world. Consider the Capetian dynasty in France. While not regents in the same way, early Capetian kings were often weak, their power dwarfed by their own powerful vassals. Yet through shrewd political maneuvering and the steady, bureaucratic work of expanding royal law and administration, they slowly built the foundations of a strong, centralized French monarchy. The Hojo were doing something similar but with a crucial difference. In France, the goal was to strengthen the monarchy itself. In Japan, the Hojo regency was strengthening the shogunate as an institution, all while ensuring the actual shogun remained a powerless figurehead. Why did this system of rule by regent prove so durable in Japan? Because the Hojo presented themselves not as usurpers but as loyal stewards. They upheld the symbolic authority of the shogun and the emperor, all the while meticulously building a bureaucratic state that answered only to them. They proved that in feudal Japan, the title was not where the power resided, it was in the control of the system itself. The careful political order built by the Hojo regents faced its ultimate test not from a rival samurai clan but from a storm gathering across the sea. In 1274, a colossal fleet appeared off the coast of Kyushu, sent by Kublai Khan, the ruler of the vast Mongol Empire. This was no ordinary army. The Japanese defenders, accustomed to the ritualized single combat of samurai warfare, were horrified. The Mongols fought as a single, disciplined unit, using poisoned arrows, explosive projectiles, and tactics of mass encirclement that made individual bravery almost meaningless. The samurai were pushed to the brink, but a sudden, violent typhoon struck, scattering and sinking a significant portion of the Mongol invasion force. The attackers withdrew, but everyone knew they would return. 7 years later, they did, with an even larger armada, one of the greatest invasion fleets in human history until the 20th century. For nearly 2 months, the outnumbered Japanese samurai fought a desperate, holding action from fortified walls along the coast, their swords and arrows against the Mongols' sheer numbers and advanced weaponry. Then, as hope seemed lost, another tremendous typhoon roared across the sea, utterly obliterating the Mongol fleet. To the Japanese, this was no mere weather event. It was a kamikaze, a divine wind, a direct intervention by the gods to protect their sacred islands. This shared, existential threat forged a powerful new sense of national identity. For the first time, samurai from clans across Japan had fought side by side not for a local lord, but for Japan itself under the overall command of the Hojo-led shogunate. This experience mirrors other great medieval invasions, like the Moorish armies pushing into France or the Viking longships raiding every European coastline. In Europe, however, such threats often reinforced local power. A French duke would raise his own army to defend his own lands, his loyalty to a distant king an afterthought. The response was fragmented because the political identity was fragmented. But in Japan, the shogunate in Kamakura was the only institution capable of organizing a national defense. It mobilized warriors from all provinces, coordinated the building of coastal fortifications, and claimed credit for the divine favor that saved the nation. The kamikaze did not just sink ships, it solidified the idea that Japan was a unique, divinely protected land united under the rule of the samurai. The shogunate, not the emperor in Kyoto, had proven itself the true guardian of the realm. Yet the divine wind that saved Japan also sowed the seeds of the shogunate's collapse. The Hojo regions had led the nation to victory, but they faced an impossible task in its aftermath. How do you reward an entire class of warriors who defended the country when there is no new land to give them? The Mongols had been repelled, not conquered, so there were no spoils of war to distribute. Samurai across the islands felt cheated of their rightful reward, their loyalty strained to the breaking point. It was into this simmering cauldron of discontent that a bold and charismatic figure stepped, Emperor Go-Daigo. He looked at the weakened Kamakura shogunate and saw a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. He would not be a mere symbol. He dreamed of a Kemu restoration, a sweeping return to the ancient past where the emperor would wield both spiritual and political power, just as he had 1,000 years before. To achieve this, he needed a sword, and he found one in a powerful, ambitious warlord, Ashikaga Takoji. Go-Daigo promised Takoji glory and the title of shogun if he would turn against the Hojo. The alliance worked perfectly at first. Ashikaga's armies smashed the Hojo forces, and the Kamakura shogunate, which had ruled for nearly a century and a half, crumbled into dust. In 1333, Emperor Go-Daigo stood triumphant, believing the age of the samurai was over and the age of the emperor had begun again. But his dream lasted for only 3 short years. Why did this bold restoration fail so spectacularly? Go-Daigo made a fatal miscalculation. He was a scholar steeped in the old ways of the Kyoto court. When it came time to reward the samurai who had fought for him, he favored court nobles and his own academic friends, handing out prestigious titles and minor posts while ignoring the warriors who expected land and real power. He fundamentally misunderstood the engine of samurai loyalty. To a warrior, loyalty was not given for poetry or ancient prestige. It was a transaction paid for in land and authority. Ashikaga Takoji, feeling sidelined and betrayed, saw his chance. He turned his armies against the emperor he had just installed, driving Go-Daigo from Kyoto and declaring himself the new shogun in 1336. The Kemu restoration was dead. This failure stands in stark contrast to a place where emperors did successfully reclaim power, the Byzantine Empire. There, even after periods of military dominance by powerful generals, emperors like Basil I could sometimes wrest back control. The key difference was structural. In Byzantium, the emperor was the unquestioned head of both church and state, a sacred autocrat whose authority was woven into a massive, centuries-old imperial bureaucracy. The system was designed to center on him. In Japan, that centralizing system had vanished centuries earlier. Power had been rooted in the countryside, in the private estates and warrior bands for far too long. The emperor in Kyoto had no army of his own, no independent tax base, and no administrative machinery that was not already controlled by the samurai class. He was a magnificent figurehead trying to command a ship whose crew answered to a different captain. Go-Daigo's failed gamble proved, once and for all, that the samurai were not just a military force, they were the government. Any attempt to rule Japan would now have to go through them, or it would not rule at all. The new Ashikaga shogunate set up its government in the Muramachi district of Kyoto, a deliberate move to place themselves at the very heart of the old imperial world. But this return to the capital was not a sign of strength, it was a compromise. Unlike the Kamakura-shogunate, which had built a robust, independent military state far from the court's influence, the Ashikaga had to rule from within a complex web of ancient alliances and rivalries. They did not command the same direct loyalty from the country's warriors. Instead, their power depended entirely on a new class of regional strongmen known as the Shugo daimyo. These were not just military governors, they were lords of vast provinces who controlled their own armies and collected their own taxes. The Ashikaga shogun was less an absolute ruler and more the head of a powerful and often quarrelsome family council. This created a system of extreme decentralization, a patchwork of semi-independent domains. To understand its nature, look not to the rising kingdoms of England or France, but to the sprawling, fragmented Holy Roman Empire in the heart of Europe. Both the Ashikaga shogunate and the Holy Roman Empire were collections of powerful, nearly sovereign states whose local rulers paid lip service to a distant, often weak, central authority. An Ashikaga shogun could not simply order a Shugo daimyo to obey. He had to negotiate, flatter, and sometimes even fight him. Power was not centralized in a single capital. It was dispersed across hundreds of castles and provincial courts. So why did Japan and the Holy Roman Empire struggle to unify while England and France were slowly building strong, centralized monarchies? The answer lies in the source of a ruler's power. In places like England, kings worked tirelessly to create national institutions that bypassed their powerful nobles. They established royal courts that applied a common law to every corner of the realm and built tax systems that filled the royal treasury directly. But in Japan, the Ashikaga shoguns derived their authority from the very daimyo they were supposed to control. Their legitimacy came from managing the balance of power between these regional lords, not from building a state that stood above them. The shogunate became a prize to be manipulated by the most powerful families, a center of elaborate culture and politics, but one whose commands often faded to a whisper beyond the city limits of Kyoto. This delicate balance could create brilliant periods of peace and artistic flourishing, but it was a peace built on a powder keg of regional ambition, a structure destined to eventually shatter. The delicate balance of the Ashikaga shogunate finally shattered in the year 1467. It began not on a distant battlefield, but in the very heart of the capital, Kyoto, with a dispute over a few decorative pots in a garden. This trivial argument between two rival warlords, Hasakawa Katsumoto and Yamana Sozan, ignited a firestorm. Both men were Shugo daimyo, powerful regional lords who served as the shogunate's own pillars of support, and they had backed different candidates to become the next shogun. What started as a political squabble exploded into a decade of pure devastation known as the Onin War. For 10 long years, the two factions turned the magnificent capital into a charred wasteland. Palaces, temples, and libraries that had stood for centuries were reduced to ashes as armies fought street by street, house by house. The shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimasa, was supposed to be the ultimate authority, the man who could command these lords to stand down. Instead, he retreated to his villa, composing poetry and sponsoring tea ceremonies while his capital burned around him. His complete impotence was a signal to every ambitious lord across Japan. The central government was now a hollow shell, its power gone. This collapse mirrors another great feudal breakdown, the period known as the Anarchy in 12th century England. There, a similar succession crisis after the death of King Henry I plunged the kingdom into a 19-year civil war between his daughter, Matilda, and his nephew, Stephen. Castles sprang up across the countryside as barons fought for their own gain, ignoring the crown's authority. Law and order disintegrated, with chroniclers of the time lamenting that Christ and his saints slept. Both the Onin War and the Anarchy were more than just civil wars, they were system failures. They proved that when the central authority tasked with mediating between powerful nobles became weak or disputed, the entire feudal structure could unravel into a free-for-all. But the outcomes, while similar in the short term, would diverge. In England, the anarchy ended with a compromise that restored a strong, centralized monarchy under Henry II. In Japan, however, the end of the Onin War in 1477 brought no peace and no restoration. It merely marked the beginning of a century of even greater chaos, a period where the map of Japan would be redrawn not by emperors or shoguns, but by men who rose from the mud with nothing but ambition and a sword. The capital of Kyoto lay in ruins, a smoking testament to the shogun's irrelevance. But the fire of the Onin War did not go out, it simply spread. For the next century and a half, Japan plunged into the abyss of the Sengoku Jidai, the age of warring states. This was not a single war, but a state of perpetual, total conflict where the only law was the sword. The old Shugo daimyo, the governors appointed by the shogunate, were swept away. In their place rose a new breed of warlord, the Sengoku daimyo. These men were true self-made rulers, emerging from the chaos by any means necessary. Some were low-ranking samurai, others were peasant revolutionaries, and a few were even monks who traded prayer beads for battle standards. Their motto was Gakokujo, which means the low overthrowing the high. Loyalty to the emperor or the shogun was a forgotten concept, a quaint story from a bygone era. A daimyo's only concern was the survival and expansion of his own domain. To govern their fractured realms, these warlords pioneered a new kind of power center, the castle town. These were not just solitary forts on a hill, but entire, planned cities built around a formidable central castle. Within their walls, samurai were required to live close to their lord, creating a permanent, ready army. Artisans and merchants were invited to settle, creating a self-sufficient economic engine for the domain. A castle town was a state in miniature, a declaration that the daimyo within needed nothing from the outside world, especially not from a powerless shogun in a distant, broken capital. This era of brutal fragmentation finds a powerful mirror in an earlier period of Chinese history, the Warring States period. For centuries, 7 major states in China fought for total supremacy, their conflicts driven by ever-evolving military tactics and political intrigue. The parallel is striking, a landscape where multiple powerful states vie for control of a single civilization, yet a profound difference would dictate their ultimate fates. In China, the warring states were distinct entities with their own cultures, languages, and ethnic identities. The state of Qin ultimately conquered the others and forcibly unified them, imposing a single script and a harsh legalist system to meld them into one empire. In Japan, however, every single daimyo, from the northernmost tip of Honshu to the southern shores of Kyushu, shared the same fundamental culture. They worshipped the same Shinto gods, looked to the same emperor as a spiritual figurehead, and adhered to the same warrior ethos of Bushido. They were all Japanese, competing for the crown of a kingdom that already existed in their hearts and minds. This shared identity, buried beneath a century of warfare, was the secret ingredient that would make Japan's eventual reunification not just a military conquest but a national restoration. The stage was set for the arrival of 3 unifiers, men who would use the very tools forged in this age of chaos to piece the nation back together. Amidst the relentless warfare of the Sengoku period, a singular code gave the chaos a terrible meaning. This was Bushido, the way of the warrior, a set of principles that transformed the samurai from mere soldiers into the disciplined backbone of a fractured society. Unlike the detailed legal codes of the Hojo regents, Bushido was largely unwritten, an ethos passed down through example and stern instruction. Its core was a brutal, beautiful simplicity, absolute loyalty to one's lord, a fierce personal honor, and the serene acceptance of death. For a samurai, surrender was not an option, capture was the ultimate disgrace. The only honorable end for a defeated warrior was seppuku, a ritual suicide by disembowelment, which demonstrated a final, transcendent act of will and responsibility. This mindset created a warrior who saw his entire life as a preparation for a meaningful death. Now compare this to the European knight and his code of chivalry. Both systems prized honor and loyalty, but their sources and expressions were worlds apart. European chivalry was deeply infused with Christian values, a knight's oath sworn on the Bible, his battles sometimes framed as crusades for God. It also carried a romantic, almost poetic dimension, the ideal of courtly love where a knight would dedicate his deeds to a noble lady, a figure often placed on a pedestal, admired from afar. The samurai's bushido had no such romanticism. His loyalty was not to a distant lady or a universal god, but directly and ferociously to his feudal lord, the daimyo. This relationship was the entire axis of his moral world. A knight might strive for personal glory on the tournament field to win a lady's favor, but a samurai sought only to fulfill his duty, to live and die in a manner that brought honor to his clan. This fundamental difference shaped their societies. The European knight was part of a three-part social order: those who pray, those who fight, and those who work. His chivalric code, with its Christian and romantic elements, helped integrate him into this broader feudal structure. The samurai, by contrast, existed in a two-tiered world with his lord above and everyone else below. His bushido was an internal, clan-focused discipline that created unparalleled cohesion within a domain, but did little to bridge the gap with the peasant or merchant classes. So why did these warrior codes diverge so sharply? The answer lies in the stability of the power they served. European chivalry often flourished in courts with established hereditary monarchs, allowing for ideals of romance and religious piety to blend with martial virtue. But bushido was forged in the crucible of Japan's endless civil wars, where a daimyo's power was fragile and constantly tested. In such an environment, there was no room for poetic gestures, only for the cold, hard currency of total, unquestioning loyalty. The samurai's heart had to be as sharp and single-purpose as his sword. A storm of black powder and foreign prayers arrived on a tiny island south of Kyushu in 1543. A Chinese junk carrying Portuguese traders was blown off course, and when its crew waded ashore, they carried objects that would shatter the rhythms of Japanese warfare. The most consequential was the arquebus, a matchlock firearm that could punch through a samurai's finest armor with a pull of the trigger. This was not a gradual technological shift, it was an earthquake. The legendary daimyo Oda Nobunaga, one of the three great unifiers, immediately grasped its power. He standardized the weapon and drilled his ashigaru, his foot soldiers, to fire in rotating volleys, a tactic that rendered the samurai's cherished single combat as obsolete as a wooden sword. A new kind of army was born, one where disciplined, massed firepower trumped individual martial skill. Alongside the traders came the Jesuits, led by the formidable Francis Xavier. They brought a new god, a new cosmology, and a message that directly challenged the authority of both Buddhist monasteries and the daimyo who patronized them. For a time, many powerful warlords, especially in the south, tolerated or even converted to this new faith. They saw practical advantages, welcoming the Portuguese trading ships that followed the missionaries, ships laden with silk, spices, and most importantly, more guns. This cultural and technological shockwave bears a fascinating resemblance to the Moorish influence on medieval Spain. For centuries, Islamic caliphates ruled much of the Iberian Peninsula, introducing advanced mathematics, astronomy, and architectural marvels like the Alhambra. Spanish society, though often at war with its Moorish rulers, gradually absorbed these influences, weaving Arabic words into its language and Moorish designs into its art. The foreign became, over time, an inseparable thread in the fabric of Spain. Japan, however, would take a radically different path. After an initial period of intense curiosity and adoption, the Japanese reaction turned to deep suspicion and finally to violent expulsion. Why did Spain assimilate while Japan ultimately purged? The difference was one of perception and control. In Spain, the Moors were a rival political and military power, a civilization to be conquered and absorbed. In Japan, the Europeans were not conquerors but influencers, their religion and goods spreading like a virus through the body politic, undermining the very social hierarchy that the daimyo fought to control. The Jesuits threatened to create a class of people whose primary loyalty was to a foreign pope, not to their local lord. The trading ports created wealthy, independent merchant classes that existed outside the feudal structure. The initial embrace of guns and God was a tactical decision, but the long-term survival of the samurai order would soon demand a far more ruthless response. A new kind of daimyo rose from the ashes of the Onin War, a man whose ambition was as limitless as his cruelty. Oda Nobunaga began with a single, small province, Owari, surrounded by enemies on all sides. Yet he saw the fractured map of Japan not as a barrier but as an invitation. His rise was built on a simple, brutal philosophy. If an enemy stood in his way, that enemy was to be annihilated completely and without mercy. He demonstrated this at the Battle of Okazama in 1560. Facing an army of 25,000 with a force of just 3,000, he did not meet them in an honorable stand. Instead, he waited for a thunderstorm, and while his enemies were drunk and celebrating their certain victory, he launched a surprise attack that decimated their camp and killed their commander. This was not the way of the noble samurai, it was the way of a predator. His most famous demonstration of tactical genius came at the Battle of Nagashino in 1575. A powerful rival clan, the Taikta, fielded what was considered the finest cavalry in all Japan, a force that had crushed every army it had ever faced. Nobunaga prepared not with a wall of elite swordsmen, but with 3,000 ashigaru foot soldiers, each armed with the new Portuguese arquebus. He built a complex series of wooden palisades along a riverbank, and as the Taikta cavalry charged in their glorious, doomed waves, his gunners fired in disciplined, rotating volleys. The smoke and thunder of gunfire drowned out the battle cries, and the legendary Taikta cavalry was literally shot to pieces. This was more than a victory. It was a declaration that the age of romantic, individual combat was over, replaced by cold, industrial slaughter. Nobunaga's ruthlessness extended beyond the battlefield to the powerful Buddhist monasteries, which had become wealthy, militant states unto themselves. He saw them as a direct threat to his authority. When the warrior monks of Enryakuji Temple on Mount Hiei opposed him, he did not lay a siege. He ordered his army to climb the sacred mountain and put its entire community to the sword, burning the complex to the ground and killing tens of thousands of monks, women, and children. He would brook no rival power, spiritual or temporal. In his relentless drive to centralize Japan under his sole command, Nobunaga finds a dark twin in King Louis XI of France, the man history nicknamed the Spider King. Louis inherited a kingdom torn apart by rebellious nobles, much like the warring daimyo of Japan. He too used any means necessary to crush his opposition, favoring intrigue, bribery, and treachery over open battle. He created a network of spies and manipulated his enemies into destroying each other, weaving a web of control that slowly strangled their independence. Both men, Nobunaga and Louis, shared a singular vision, the creation of a unified, centralized state where their word was the only law. They were not building a balanced feudal system, they were building an autocracy. Why did such ruthlessness become necessary in both France and Japan at this specific historical moment? Because the old order of shared power among nobles had collapsed into self-destructive chaos. In that vacuum, only a figure willing to break all the old rules and shatter all the old loyalties could forge a new, stronger whole. Nobunaga's legacy was a Japan half-forged in fire, a nation terrified into a semblance of unity, waiting for the next leader who could temper that brutal unity into something that would last. Nobunaga's brutal unification was left unfinished at the moment of his betrayal and death. Into that power vacuum stepped a man who should never have held a sword, let alone commanded an empire. Toyotomi Hideyoshi began his life as a peasant, the son of a foot soldier, with no family name or noble lineage to recommend him. He entered Oda Nobunaga's service as a lowly sandal-bearer, but his cunning, his charisma, and his sheer, unshakable competence saw him rise with breathtaking speed. He was the ultimate outsider, a man who turned his lack of noble blood into his greatest advantage because he owed his position to no one but himself and his master's favor. When a treacherous general forced Nobunaga to commit seppuku in 1582, Hideyoshi moved with lightning speed. He hunted down and crushed the usurper, avenging his lord and positioning himself as Nobunaga's true successor. He then subdued rival clans not just with overwhelming force, but with brilliant diplomacy, convincing many to join him rather than be destroyed. By 1590, he had achieved the impossible, completing the military unification of Japan that Nobunaga had begun. He was granted the title of Kampoku, or imperial regent, and ruled as the undisputed master of the realm. This ascent from the mud of the fields to the pinnacle of power is almost unthinkable in the context of medieval Europe. Imagine a serf born into a life of grinding labor tied to a specific plot of land, somehow becoming the king of France. The rigid feudal structure, the divine right of kings, the unbreachable wall of noble blood, all made such social mobility a fantasy. Yet in the chaos of the Sengoku period, where Gakokujo was the rule, talent and ambition could, and did, trump birthright. Hideyoshi was living proof that in Japan, the right man at the right time could reshape the entire social order. But how does a peasant who has seized power ensure that no other peasant ever follows his path? His answer was as brilliant as it was ruthless, a set of policies designed to freeze the social hierarchy in place for centuries. The most famous of these was the Great Sword Hunt of 1588. Hideyoshi issued an edict that every sword, every dagger, every spear in the possession of peasants and Buddhist temples must be confiscated. His officials swept through the villages, melting down the collected weapons to create a giant Buddha statue, a symbolic act of turning instruments of war into an object of peace. The goal was not just to disarm potential rebels, it was to draw a permanent, uncrossable line between the warrior class and everyone else. From that moment on, only the samurai had the right to carry a sword. A farmer could not be a soldier, and a soldier would not farm. This was a social revolution from above, creating a rigid four-class system with samurai at the top, followed by farmers, then artisans and merchants at the bottom. This stands in stark contrast to the military evolution happening in Europe. There, the rise of professional pike and gunpowder armies was slowly making the armored knight obsolete, but it did not lead to a formal, legal disarming of the commoners. In many European kingdoms, peasants still kept hunting weapons, and town militias remained a vital part of local defense. Hideyoshi's sword hunt was something far more absolute, a deliberate act of social engineering to prevent anyone from below ever challenging the ruling class again. Yet for all his domestic control, Hideyoshi's ambition soon gazed outward toward a prize that would ultimately prove beyond his grasp. He set his sights on the conquest of China, planning to march through Korea and overthrow the mighty Ming dynasty. In 1592, he launched a massive invasion, sending over 150,000 seasoned troops across the sea. The Japanese armies, hardened by a century of civil war, initially overwhelmed the Korean defenders. But the campaign stalled. The Korean Navy, led by the brilliant Admiral Yi Sun-sin and his revolutionary turtle ships, severed Japanese supply lines. The vastness of the Korean and Chinese armies, coupled with fierce guerrilla resistance, ground the invasion to a bloody halt. Hideyoshi launched a second, equally disastrous invasion in 1597, and the entire venture collapsed with his death in 1598. These Korean campaigns drained the treasury, cost countless lives, and achieved nothing. They reveal a crucial truth about Hideyoshi's rule. He could unite Japan by force and cunning, but he could not command the wider world. His dream of an overseas empire was the overreach of a man who had broken every ceiling at home and believed no ceiling existed abroad. His legacy was therefore a paradox, a unified Japan forged by a peasant, who then ensured no peasant would ever rule again, a nation now at peace, but a peace built on a rigid class system that would define it for the next 300 years. Hideyoshi's sword hunt was more than just a disarmament, it was the blueprint for a new kind of society. His edicts did not simply take weapons from peasants, they systematically dismantled the very possibility of another Gekkokujo uprising. He followed the sword hunt with a series of separation edicts that legally and permanently froze the population into 4 distinct classes: samurai, farmers, artisans, and merchants. This was not a suggestion, it was a rigid caste system. A samurai was forbidden from working the land, a farmer was forbidden from leaving his village to become a soldier, and an artisan or merchant was locked into their trade, with their status becoming hereditary. The entire structure was designed for one purpose: control. By legally separating the warrior class from the productive classes, Hideyoshi ensured that the means of violence and the means of production would never again be combined in the hands of a potential rival. This created a perverse kind of stability, a society where everyone knew their place and upward mobility was not just difficult, it was illegal. The system was so effective that it became the bedrock of the Tokugawa shogunate that followed, providing 250 years of unprecedented peace, but at the cost of social stagnation. This rigid 4-tier system invites a direct comparison with the 3 estates of medieval Europe: those who pray, the clergy; those who fight, the nobility; and those who work, the commoners. On the surface, they seem similar. Both are hierarchical pyramids designed to maintain order. But which system was more effective at social control? The European model was more fluid and, paradoxically, more fragile. The line between noble and commoner could be crossed through royal service, through the purchase of titles, or through marriage. The clergy was a separate estate entirely, a powerful institution that often rivaled the nobility and provided a path for educated commoners to rise to immense influence. This created tensions and opportunities. In Japan, Hideyoshi's system was brutally simple and absolute. There was no separate clerical class. Buddhist monks and Shinto priests were largely absorbed into the social hierarchy, not outside it. The merchant class, officially at the bottom, was not a monolithic block of commoners, but a distinct group legally separated from the farmers who were prized above them. This hyper-compartmentalization made the Japanese system far more effective at preventing the kind of cross-class alliances that could challenge the ruling samurai. A wealthy merchant could not buy a sword, let alone the right to carry one. A brilliant peasant scholar could not enter the bureaucracy. The system's very inflexibility was the source of its strength, creating a social order so rigid that it could withstand centuries without a single successful internal revolt. Why did Europe's system allow for more cracks and crevices? Because European feudalism was a patchwork of competing powers: king, church, and nobility, each needing to recruit talent and wealth from the classes below to gain an advantage over the others. In Japan, after Hideyoshi, there was only one real power, the samurai class, and they closed ranks completely. They created a world where the only ambition allowed was ambition within your station, a philosophy that would define Japan long after the last sword was buried. While Hideyoshi forged his empire, another man watched and waited from the fertile Kanto plain. Tokugawa-Ieyasu understood a truth that had eluded both Nobunaga's fire and Hideyoshi's cunning, that the ultimate victory belongs not to the swift but to the patient. His entire life was a masterclass in strategic endurance. As a boy, he was held as a political hostage for years, learning the arts of survival in a rival court. He built his power base not through dramatic conquests but through careful, relentless consolidation. When offered the bleak, underdeveloped Kanto region, other daimyo would have scoffed. Ieyasu saw its potential, its vast farmlands that could feed a massive army and its defensive distance from the volatile capital. He moved his headquarters to a small fishing village called Edo, and there he began the quiet, meticulous work of transforming a swamp into the future heart of Japan. His alliance with Hideyoshi was the pinnacle of this patience. He recognized Hideyoshi's rising star, and instead of challenging it directly, he bowed. He became Hideyoshi's most powerful vassal, even sending his own family members as hostages to prove his loyalty. He swallowed his pride to preserve his strength, understanding that some battles are won by refusing to fight them. In this, he finds a remarkable parallel in a king across the world, Henry VII of England. After decades of civil war known as the War of the Roses, Henry seized the crown, but his true genius lay in keeping it. He did so not through glorious battles, but through thrifty management, legal reforms, and a series of strategic marriages that tied rival noble families to his new Tudor dynasty. Both Ieyasu and Henry were masters of the long game, men who prioritized stable institutions over personal glory. They learned from the fatal mistakes of their predecessors, who often won wars but failed to secure the peace. So why does patience so often triumph over sheer force? Because fury burns hot and fast, while calculated planning builds foundations that last for centuries. Ieyasu was not just waiting for his rivals to die, he was waiting for the perfect moment when the nation, exhausted by a century of war, would willingly trade chaos for any promise of order. That moment was now on the horizon, and Ieyasu, the master of patience, was perfectly poised to provide it. The rain fell in relentless, icy sheets, turning the valley of Sekigahara into a sea of churning mud on the morning of October 21, 1600. Through the fog and downpour, two colossal armies faced each other, over 160,000 men representing the final, unresolved fault line of a century of civil war. On one side stood the loyalists of the late Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a coalition of powerful Western daimyo led by the young and politically naive Ishida Mitsunari. Arrayed against them was Tokugawa Ieyasu and his Eastern alliance. This was not merely a battle, it was a national referendum, and its outcome would echo for 250 years. For hours, the fighting was a brutal, grinding stalemate in the miserable conditions. The massed ranks of pikemen and samurai clashed in the fog, their movements slowed by the mud, their vision obscured by the storm. The entire battle, and with it the future of Japan, hinged on the actions of one man and his 20,000 fresh troops watching from a flanking hill. Kobayakawa Hidaki, a young general promised immense rewards by Ieyasu, was supposed to crash down into the Tokugawa flank, sealing Ieyasu's doom. But as the battle raged, his banners remained motionless. Ieyasu, watching this betrayal in waiting, made a desperate gamble. He ordered his matchlock gunners to fire a volley directly at Kobayakawa's position on the hillside. It was not an attack, it was a question, a final, violent demand for an answer. The thunder of the guns provided it. Kobayakawa, either shocked into action or finally convinced of Ieyasu's resolve, ordered his entire army to charge not against Ieyasu, but directly into the flank of his own allies. That single, treacherous decision shattered the Western army's cohesion. Other daimyo, seeing the tide turn, switched sides in the middle of the combat, sealing the coalition's fate. By afternoon, the loyalist forces were routed and Ishida Mitsunari was captured, later executed in Kyoto. Ieyasu was the undisputed master of Japan. The scale and decisiveness of Sekigahara invites a direct comparison with another battle that forged a nation, the Battle of Hastings in 1066. Both were single-day engagements of shocking finality. At Hastings, William the Conqueror's victory extinguished the old Anglo-Saxon ruling class and imposed a new Norman order on England, reshaping its language, laws, and land ownership for centuries. Sekigahara achieved the same political extinction, but for a different class. It was not a foreign conquest, but a domestic reckoning that systematically dismantled the power of the Western daimyo who had opposed Ieyasu. Their lands were confiscated and redistributed to his loyal followers in the greatest act of property redistribution in Japanese history. So why could a single day of combat in 1600 establish a dynasty that would rule until the 1860s, when a battle like Hastings, while foundational, did not prevent centuries of subsequent succession crises and civil war in England? The answer lies in what happened after the fighting stopped. William won a crown at Hastings and then spent years crushing rebellions, his control constantly tested. Ieyasu, however, had spent a lifetime learning from the failures of Nobunaga and Hideyoshi. He understood that victory on the battlefield was only the first step. The true work was to build a system so robust, so meticulously engineered for control, that no future battle would ever be necessary. Sekigahara gave him the power, but his patience would give Japan the Tokugawa peace. With the mud of Sekigahara still fresh, Tokugawa Ieyasu began constructing a cage of such intricate design it would hold Japan in an unbreakable peace for 2.5 centuries. His genius was not in winning the war, but in winning the peace that followed. He established the Tokugawa shogunate, or bakufu, in his now powerful city of Edo, but he did not try to rule every inch of Japan directly. Instead, he perfected a system of controlled decentralization known as the Bakuhan system. The bakufu was his central government, the ultimate authority. The Han were the nearly 300 domains granted to the daimyo, the feudal lords. These lords were allowed to govern their own territories with considerable autonomy, collecting taxes and administering local laws. But this was not a gift of freedom, it was a trap of responsibility. Ieyasu had learned from the Ashikaga shoguns that a weak center leads to warlords running rampant. So he created a structure where the daimyo could enjoy their local power only as long as they remained utterly subservient to Edo. The entire system was a masterful balance, giving the daimyo just enough rope to feel empowered, but not enough to ever hang the shogunate. The most brilliant mechanism of this control was the Sankin Kotai system, or alternate attendance. This was a policy of institutionalized hostage-taking disguised as a ceremonial duty. Every single daimyo was required to maintain 2 lavish households, one in his home domain and an even grander one in the shogun's capital of Edo. More importantly, the daimyo himself was compelled to travel back and forth between these 2 residences, spending every other year in attendance on the shogun. When he returned to his domain, he was forced to leave his wife and children behind in Edo, where they lived as permanent, though honored, prisoners. The financial burden of this was staggering. A daimyo had to pay for the construction and upkeep of 2 large estates, fund a constant stream of lavish processions back and forth across the country, and maintain a lifestyle in Edo befitting the shogun's court. This relentless cycle of expenditure drained the treasuries of even the wealthiest domains, ensuring no daimyo could ever amass the surplus wealth needed to fund a rebellion. The system did more than just impoverish them, it domesticated them. By forcing the warrior lords to become courtiers, administrators, and travelers, it slowly eroded their martial spirit and bound them into a web of obligation and etiquette centered entirely on Edo. This structure presents a fascinating contrast to the model of absolutist control emerging in Europe under monarchs like Louis XIV of France. Louis, the Sun King, sought to centralize all power in his own person at the magnificent palace of Versailles. He demanded that his powerful nobles leave their provincial castles and live permanently at his court, where he could keep a close watch on them. The goal was the same as Ieyasu's, to neutralize the threat of rebellious aristocrats, but the methods and their effectiveness differed profoundly. Louis's system was one of pure centralization, drawing all power, all decision-making, and all cultural life to one glorious, gilded center. Ieyasu's system was one of calculated decentralization. He did not want to run every domain himself, he simply wanted to ensure they could not run against him. Financially, Louis drained his nobles by encouraging them to bankrupt themselves through lavish spending at court, a tactic similar to Sankin-kotai. But Ieyasu made this financial drain a mandatory, non-negotiable law of the state, applied equally to all daimyo. The result was a system arguably more resilient against internal revolt. While France would later be torn apart by revolution, the Tokugawa shogunate maintained an unbroken internal peace for over 250 years. Why was the Japanese model so durable? Because it did not just control the daimyo, it reconfigured their entire existence, turning potential rivals into financially strained, politically neutered administrators who were too busy following the rules to ever think of breaking them. Yet even after Sekigahara, one final shadow loomed over Ieyasu's new order. In the heart of Osaka stood Osaka Castle, a formidable fortress that was the legacy of Toyotomi Hideyoshi himself. And within its walls lived his son and heir, a young boy named Toyotomi Hideyori. For the Tokugawa, Hideyori was more than a person, he was a symbol, a living reminder of the old regime that could one day become a rallying point for every disgruntled daimyo in Japan. Ieyasu, now an old man but with his strategic patience undimmed, knew this could not stand. The result was two brutal sieges that would crush the last ember of resistance. The Winter Siege of 1614 began not with a direct assault, but with a masterstroke of psychological warfare. Ieyasu's massive army surrounded the castle and then began a relentless artillery bombardment. But his real target was not the stone walls, it was the morale of the 40,000 ronin, or masterless samurai, who had flocked to Hideyori's cause. These were the last true veterans of the Sengoku period, men with nothing left to lose, and they fought with a desperate fury. The siege reached a stalemate and a temporary truce was signed. As part of the agreement, the Tokugawa forces insisted on filling in the castle's outer moat, supposedly as a gesture of peace. But as soon as the truce was declared, they didn't just fill the moat, they demolished the entire outer line of defenses, leaving the castle's heart terrifyingly exposed. It was a blatant act of bad faith, a calculated provocation designed to force the Toyotomi loyalists into one final, doomed battle. The following summer, in 1615, the Tokugawa army returned. The summer siege was a foregone conclusion. The defenses were gone, and the Tokugawa forces poured into the outer grounds. It was here that the last legend of the Sengoku period met his end. The samurai Sanada Yukimura, known as the hero who appeared and disappeared like a demon, led a final, desperate countercharge. With a small band of men, he fought his way directly through the entire Tokugawa army, aiming for one target only, the command tent of Ieyasu himself. He reportedly came so close that he actually struck the tent with his spear, causing panic in the Tokugawa ranks before he was finally overwhelmed and killed. His death was more than the fall of a great warrior, it was the extinguishing of an era. The castle fell soon after. Hideyori committed seppuku, and his infant son was executed, ensuring the Toyotomi bloodline was erased forever. This final, brutal consolidation of power finds a clear parallel in the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, which ended England's Wars of the Roses. There, Henry Tudor defeated and killed King Richard III, the last Plantagenet king. Just as Ieyasu eliminated the Toyotomi, Henry systematically hunted down and executed any remaining Yorkist claimants to the throne, including a young boy many believed to be the rightful heir. Both victors understood that to secure a new dynasty, the old one must not just be defeated, it must be forgotten. The fall of Osaka Castle was Japan's Bosworth. It marked the absolute end of the Sengoku period and the final, undeniable triumph of the Tokugawa. There were no more rivals, no more shadows, no more legitimate threats. The age of warring states was officially over, and the great peace of the Tokugawa could finally begin in earnest. The great peace of the Tokugawa demanded a final, absolute barrier against the outside world. From the 1630s onward, the shogunate issued a series of decrees known collectively as sakoku, the closed country policy. This was not a simple closing of the doors, it was the systematic construction of a cultural fortress. The shoguns, having unified Japan through immense bloodshed, now saw their greatest threats not in rival samurai, but in the twin dangers of foreign influence and domestic disloyalty. The primary target was Christianity. The Jesuit missionaries, once tolerated for their connection to Portuguese trade, were now seen as a fifth column, preaching allegiance to a foreign god that could undermine the loyalty of every samurai and peasant to their lord. The shogunate launched a brutal and systematic persecution, crucifying believers and forcing suspected Christians to trample on sacred images to prove their rejection of the faith. But the policy was about more than just religion. It was about economic control. The shoguns remembered how some Western daimyo, like the powerful Shimazu clan, had grown wealthy and independent through direct trade with the Portuguese and Spanish. Sakoku severed that lifeline. All foreign trade was now funneled through a handful of tightly controlled gates. Chinese and Dutch merchants were restricted to a tiny, artificial island in Nagasaki harbor, a place called Dejima, where they were kept under constant surveillance like animals in a zoo. No Japanese could leave the country, and no foreigner could enter on pain of death. This self-imposed isolation stands in breathtaking contrast to the world beyond Japan's shores. While the Tokugawa were building their walls, European nations were in the throes of the age of exploration. Spanish galleons crossed the Pacific, British East India companies were carving out global empires, and Dutch navigators were charting entire new continents. Europe was exploding outward in a frenzy of discovery, commerce, and colonization. So was Japan's decision one of brilliant cultural preservation or catastrophic self-stagnation. The policy unquestionably succeeded in its primary goal. It secured the Tokugawa peace by eliminating external influences and preventing daimyo from building independent power bases through foreign trade. The shogunate ensured 2 centuries of internal stability. Japanese arts like kabuki theater and woodblock printing flourished in this hothouse environment, developing in unique and beautiful ways untouched by outside trends. Yet this came at a cost. While Europe surged forward with the scientific revolution and the industrial age, Japanese technology, particularly in military and naval fields, began to fall dangerously behind. The world was changing at a dizzying pace, and Japan, by choice, was standing completely still. The Sakoku edicts created a perfectly preserved garden, but one that would be utterly unprepared for the storm that would eventually break down its gates. A Japanese daimyo's castle was a self-contained world, but a European baron's stone fortress was a link in a chain of royal command. Both were pillars of their respective feudal systems, yet the nature of their power reveals why Japan's peace was so absolute and Europe's kingdoms were so often at war. On the surface, the daimyo and the baron seemed to share a common blueprint. Each was a landholder who governed a territory, collected taxes from the peasants who worked the land, and commanded a private army of warriors loyal only to him. Each was also a vassal, sworn to serve a higher lord, whether a shogun in Edo or a king in London or Paris. But here the similarity ends and the critical divergence begins. The relationship between a European baron and his king was fundamentally contractual, sealed by a sacred oath of fealty. In a solemn ceremony, the baron would kneel, place his hands between those of his king, and swear an oath of loyalty. In return, the king granted him a parcel of land known as a fief. This was a mutual bargain, a bond of protection and service. If the king failed to protect his baron, or if the baron failed to provide his quota of knights for the king's army, the contract could be considered broken. This system was inherently unstable, a constant negotiation of power that often tipped into rebellion. Why did a European king's authority so frequently face direct military challenge from his own vassals? Because the contract worked both ways, a baron who felt wronged could, and often did, raise his banners against his king, claiming the monarch had violated his feudal obligations. The entire history of medieval England and France is punctuated by these noble revolts. The daimyo's bond with the shogun was something entirely different. It was less a personal contract and more a bureaucratic command. There was no ceremony of mutual oath-taking between equals. Instead, the shogunate issued edicts and the daimyo obeyed. The Tokugawa system transformed the daimyo from a potential rival warlord into a government-appointed administrator. His primary duty was not to personally lead his samurai into the shogun's wars, but to manage his domain peacefully, and most importantly, to faithfully perform his exhausting sanken-katai duties in Edo. His loyalty was not a matter of personal honor between two men, but a function of his position within a vast, impersonal state apparatus. This leads to the second great difference, the scope of their autonomy. Paradoxically, while the daimyo was more tightly controlled by the central state, he enjoyed far more power within the borders of his own han or domain than a European baron did within his county. A daimyo was a mini shogun. He had his own samurai retainers, his own legal codes, his own currency, and his own tax system. He could essentially rule his territory as a petty king, as long as his rule did not contradict the fundamental laws of the bakufu. A European baron, by contrast, was constantly hemmed in by competing powers. He had to contend with the overarching authority of royal law, the influence of the church and its separate court system, and the privileges of independent towns and their charters. His power was a patchwork of rights and limitations. The daimyo's domain was a unified statelet, while the baron's fief was a piece of a complex, overlapping quilt. This comparison reveals the core strength and the hidden fragility of the Tokugawa system. By making the daimyo a bureaucrat, it eliminated the personal, contractual justification for rebellion. But by granting him such sweeping local autonomy, it created 100 tiny, perfectly preserved worlds, each dedicated to maintaining the status quo. The system was so effective at internal control that it required a shock from the entirely outside world to finally break it apart. While the shoguns built walls against the outside world, they also constructed an intricate spiritual architecture within. The religious landscape of feudal Japan was not a simple matter of faith, but a dynamic and often dangerous force that the state struggled to control. At its heart was a unique fusion, the syncretism of native Shinto beliefs and imported Buddhist philosophy. For centuries, these were not seen as competing religions, but as two sides of the same spiritual coin. A Japanese person might worship the local Shinto kami or spirit of a mountain for protection, while also praying to a Buddhist bodhisattva for enlightenment in the next life. The kami were even reinterpreted as local manifestations of Buddhist deities, a seamless blend that allowed both traditions to flourish side by side. This peaceful coexistence, however, had a militant edge. Great Buddhist monasteries like Enryakuji on Mount Hiei and the Honganji sect in Osaka amassed vast estates, trained armies of warrior monks, and acted as independent political powers. They were a state within the state, and their militant power was a direct threat to any ruler trying to unify the country. This is why a figure like Oda Nobunaga saw them not as holy sites, but as military targets to be annihilated. The relationship between religion and power in Japan presents a stark contrast to the reality of medieval Europe. There, the Catholic Church was not just a spiritual authority, it was a towering political and economic institution. The Pope could crown emperors, excommunicate kings, and command the loyalty of millions across national borders. A monarch's power was constantly checked by the spiritual authority of the Church, creating a tense, often explosive, balance of power. In Japan, the state ultimately succeeded in subordinating religion to its will. How was this possible? The key lies in the nature of the throne. The Japanese emperor, while politically powerless under the shoguns, remained the high priest of Shinto, an unbroken divine lineage. This gave the state an inherent sacred legitimacy that no Buddhist institution could ever hope to match. The shogunate did not need to fight the church for spiritual authority because the emperor whom they claimed to protect was already the source of it. They could and did use this to their advantage, portraying themselves as the defenders of the native spiritual order. This control became absolute with the arrival of Christianity. The Jesuit missionaries brought a faith that was doctrinally exclusive and owed its ultimate allegiance to a foreign pope in Rome. To the Tokugawa shoguns, this was not just heresy, it was treason. Christianity threatened to create a class of people whose loyalty was to a power outside Japan's carefully constructed feudal hierarchy. The response was swift, systematic, and brutal. The shogunate launched intense persecutions, forcing suspected Christians to trample on sacred images and executing those who refused with horrifying public crucifixions. By the 1630s, the faith was driven entirely underground. This final, violent act of suppression proved a profound truth. In feudal Japan, no god, whether old or new, was permitted to challenge the absolute authority of the state. The spiritual realm, like the samurai himself, had to know its place. The true power of the Tokugawa peace was measured not in gold but in rice. The entire economy of feudal Japan was built upon a single, elegant, and ruthless unit of measurement, the koku. One koku was defined as the amount of rice needed to feed one person for 1 year. A samurai's stipend, a daimyo's wealth, the very value of a domain, all were calculated in koku. This created a system of astonishing simplicity and control. The shogunate assessed every domain in the country based on its estimated rice production, and a daimyo's status and military obligations were directly tied to this number. A lord worth 1 million koku, for example, was expected to provide a correspondingly large number of samurai and supplies in times of war. This rice-based economy tied the warrior class directly to the land, but in a way that kept their hands clean. Samurai lived in their lord's castle town, receiving their annual stipend in rice from the domain storehouses. They did not farm, they did not manage the fields. Their connection to the source of their wealth was purely bureaucratic. This system finds its most direct parallel in the European manorial system, where a lord's estate or manor was also the center of economic life. Peasants or serfs worked the land, giving a large portion of their grain and labor to the lord in exchange for protection and the right to farm their own small strips. Both systems were agrarian, both were rooted in the land, and both saw wealth as agricultural surplus. Yet the European manor was a closed, localized loop. The goal was self-sufficiency, to produce everything the manor needed within its own borders. Trade was minimal and money was often scarce. The Japanese system, by contrast, was from its inception a national system of accounting. The koku provided a universal standard of value that integrated every domain into the shogunate's economic web. This forced a level of economic interdependence that the manorial system never achieved. A daimyo in the far north had to convert his rice into currency to fund his costly trips to Edo, creating a massive, nationwide rice market centered in the cities. This was the first crack in a purely agrarian economy, a crack through which a new class would soon pour. While rice was the measure of stability, silver was the engine of explosive growth. In the 16th century, massive silver deposits were discovered in western Japan, particularly at the Iwami Jinzen mine. For a brief, dazzling period, Japan became one of the largest silver producers in the entire world, fueling trade across Asia and even attracting European merchants. This silver boom created fortunes overnight and funded the epic wars of the unifiers. It also supercharged the development of castle towns. A daimyo's castle was no longer just a military fortification, it was the capital of his mini-kingdom. He compelled his samurai to live in neighborhoods surrounding the castle. creating a concentrated population of consumers with disposable income from their rice stipends. To serve this new urban class, artisans and merchants flocked to these towns. Blacksmiths, armorers, sake brewers, and kimono makers set up shops, markets flourished, and roads bustled with goods. These castle towns, from Kanazawa to Hiroshima, became vibrant commercial centers, the birthplace of a sophisticated urban culture. This urban revolution mirrors the rise of trade fairs in medieval Europe, like those in the Champagne region of France. There, merchants from across the continent would gather to trade Flemish cloth for Italian silks and Eastern spices, creating hubs of commerce that began to break down the isolation of the manor. So which system proved more fertile ground for long-term economic growth and a powerful merchant class? Paradoxically, it was the seemingly more rigid Japanese model. In Europe, the merchant class often existed outside and in tension with the feudal structure, buying charters of independence for their towns and reporting directly to the king. They were a separate power base. In Japan, the merchant class was officially at the bottom of the social hierarchy, beneath the samurai, farmers, and artisans. Yet, by being physically and economically integrated into the castle towns, they became indispensable. A samurai's rice stipend was useless for buying a new sword or a theater ticket. He had to sell his rice to a merchant for cash. The merchants controlled the conversion of the entire country's wealth from grain to currency. They grew immensely rich, lending money to cash-strapped daimyo impoverished by the Sankin-kotai system. The merchant class in Japan, though socially despised, achieved a deep, systemic economic power that their European counterparts often struggled to match. They became the hidden financial architects of the Great Peace, their prosperity woven directly into the fabric of the very system that claimed to look down upon them. Amidst the endless clashing of swords, a very different kind of discipline was taking root, one that would define the samurai soul. In the smoky halls of provincial castles, under the grim shadow of civil war, an art form of stark beauty emerged: no theater. This was not a diversion for the masses, but a spiritual exercise for the warrior class. The stage was bare, the movements agonizingly slow and deliberate, the actors hidden behind expressionless masks. A no play was a meditation on loss, on ghostly regrets, and the impermanence of all things. For a samurai who lived every day with the possibility of a violent death, this art was a mirror to his own reality, a way to confront the ephemeral nature of glory and life itself. This deep introspection was fueled by the arrival of Zen Buddhism from China. Zen rejected complex scriptures, insisting that enlightenment could be found in a single moment of intense focus, whether in meditation, in the stroke of a calligraphy brush, or in the flash of a sword. It was the perfect philosophy for a warrior, teaching a mind unclouded by fear or desire, a presence so absolute it could mean the difference between life and death in combat. This spiritual partnership between Zen and the arts reached its purest expression in the tea ceremony, perfected by the master Sen no Rikyu. He stripped the ritual down to its essence, celebrating rustic, imperfect bowls and a deliberate, mindful simplicity known as wabi-sabi. In a tiny, humble terum, a daimyo and his top general would kneel in silence, their rivalries and ambitions set aside, focusing only on the sound of water boiling and the shared experience of a single bowl of tea. In that quiet space, the art of peace was practiced by the masters of war. Now compare this cultural world to the one being built in the European High Middle Ages. There, the supreme artistic achievement was the Gothic cathedral, reaching with its stone spires toward the heavens. These were colossal community projects designed to inspire awe and teach biblical stories to an illiterate populace through stained glass and sculpture. Europe was also founding its first universities, institutions dedicated to reconciling faith with reason through the scholarly work of theologians like Thomas Aquinas. The purpose of art and learning in Europe was often to glorify God and build a unified Christian society. In Japan, however, the great cultural achievements were intensely personal and introspective. The goal was not to build a monument to an external god, but to forge an unshakable inner self. The samurai did not need a cathedral to feel small before the divine. He found the infinite in the quiet of a rock garden. He did not study theology to understand virtue. He practiced calligraphy to master his own breathing. So why did these two warrior societies produce such different art? The European knight saw himself as part of a divine order, a soldier in God's army, and his culture reflected that collective, outward-looking faith. The samurai, shaped by Zen and the constant presence of death, turned inward. His greatest battle was with his own mind, and his most enduring monuments were not castles of stone, but disciplines of the spirit, crafted in an age of relentless conflict. The clash of swords has fallen silent, but the world forged by the shogun still echoes in the quiet discipline of a modern tea ceremony or the orderly bustle of a Tokyo street. Our investigation has unraveled the great mystery of feudal Japan, revealing a system born from a unique crucible of internal chaos and external shock. It was a perfect storm of civil war, the existential threat of the Mongol invasions, and the ruthless ambition of three unifiers that welded a fractured nation into a single, enduring order. This samurai state shared a surface resemblance with the castles and knights of medieval Europe, yet its inner workings were a world apart. In Europe, power was a constant negotiation between king, church, and noble, a fragile contract that often shattered into rebellion. In Japan, the Tokugawa shoguns engineered a social machine of unparalleled stability, one that traded the dynamism of conflict for 2.5 centuries of unbroken peace. They created a world where a daimyo's loyalty was secured not by a personal oath, but by the relentless financial drain of his mandatory residence in Edo, and where the entire population was locked into a rigid class system designed to prevent anyone from ever rising from the mud to seize power again. This legacy of social order and a powerful, introspective cultural identity did not vanish with the last shogun. It flows like an underground river into the corporate loyalty, the aesthetic precision, and the profound sense of collective identity that defines modern Japan. The age of the samurai is gone, but the world they built remains, a testament to the incredible lengths a society will go to in its search for stability. We have walked this path of comparison together, from the divine wind to the closed country. Now I am curious to hear from you. Which parallel struck you most deeply? Was it the different fates of the emperor and the European king, or the way a single battle like Sekigahara could lock in a peace that lasted for centuries? Share your most fascinating insight in the comments, and if you have another historical mystery you would love to see unraveled,